from my perspective, the transcendent healing presence of the divine can be found right in the interstices of daily practice, in the infinite space that subsists between our hands as practitioners and the bodies of the patients that we touch. Too few of us bother to reflect on it or to talk to each other about it, but as the poet T.S. Eliot reminds us, we had the experience, but missed the meaning. The transcendent healing presence of the divine is not only to be found in explicitly religious conversation with a couple of patients who are dying, but in all those countless moments in the office or in the hospital in which we communicate meaning and value to our patients and relate to them as whole persons. Now, a drug like adriamycin, which is used in chemotherapy, doesn't necessarily get in the way of that, but it can. If we use the drug incompetently, we betray the trust that the patient has placed in us, a trust that transcends the relationship between patient and practitioner and transcends adriamycin. To betray that trust would be to betray the spirit. But adriamycin can also get in the way of the spirit if we somehow come to believe the falsehood that either the patient's story or our story begins and ends in adriamycin. Right? There are no transcendent pharmaceutical agents, right? But there are always transcendent questions about meaning, about value, and about relationship. And spirituality in practice begins when the clinician becomes aware that these questions arise in and through illness and injury, and that they can be addressed in and through the practice of the healing arts. Paul Ramsey once reminded us that patients are first and foremost persons. I think it's time we began to recognize that physicians, nurses, and psychologists are also first and foremost persons. Now, what we do as healthcare professionals, or at least what we claim to do, is to heal. But we understand too little, I think, about what that means. Healing, etymologically, as I said before, means making whole, but maybe that's too quick. What does this making whole really mean? All too commonly, the understanding of making whole that we find in the literature is quite facile, leading to loose talk about holistic healthcare. And certainly I can't be opposed to holistic healthcare if it means attentiveness to an ill person's psychosocial and spiritual needs. However, holistic, as you know, sometimes includes the most banal fringes of New Age spirituality, suggesting almost that, if you eat this spiritual food, you will be better. I believe healing is making whole, but in a very particular way. And the understanding of healing that I want to offer you tonight, and I'm sorry it's after dinner, is going to require us to take a step back from healthcare. I want to suggest that the meaning of healing, in the way I'm presenting it, requires that we understand the constitution of the universe in a way that it might at first seem unfamiliar and strange. Now, a complete explication of what I'm proposing would require a much longer discourse in physics and metaphysics than is possible in the limited number of minutes I have with you. But briefly, the understanding I want to share with you is this, that emerges mostly from particle physics, that the basic stuff of the universe, right, the stuff we call matter, can no longer be conceptualized as what remains after we chop things up into smaller and smaller bits. Chopping is what physics, biology, and medicine did so successfully until the 20th century, breaking up bodies into parts, the parts into organs, the organs into cells, cells into molecules, molecules into atoms, and then ultimately the atoms into subatomic particles. But once you arrive, if you remember studying any of this in college, right? Once you arrive at the particle level, there's a fundamental rule that emerges that's really true about everything, no matter how big or small. And that's this, that field is prior to matter. That what matter is, or anything else is, at its most fundamental level, is not a pile of unimaginably tiny bodies, but a set of dynamic, yet temporary relationships in the electromagnetic field that's already given. Subatomic particles, right, the so-called building blocks of matter itself, can only be understood as entities that are defined as complex relationships. As the physicist Niels Bohr once put it, quote, "In our description of nature, the purpose is only to track down, as far as is possible, relations between the manifold aspects of our experience," unquote. So the naive atomism of Democritus, which was smashed by Aristotle, revived again by Galileo, refined by Dalton, and maybe made normative by J.S. Mill, has been smashed again by Einstein, Planck, Bohr, and Heisenberg. Matter is not isolated bits of individual particularity. Matter is relational. Now, from a philosophical point of view, Bernard Lonergan, the philosopher and theologian Jesuit, has argued that when we know anything, and think of thing broadly, when you know something, whatever that thing is, what you are really grasping is a complex set of relationships. Whether that thing is a quark, a virus, a patient, or a galaxy. In a brief talk, I can't say more, but the take-home message is this: being is relationship. Now, you'd think, for those of us at least who are Christian, that we would have gotten this a long time ago, that we understand the nature of the Trinity to be that God, in God's own self, is relationship. 3 persons in one. But less obviously for physicians. Sickness, rightly understood, is a disturbance in relationships. It's not looking at a bad body inside an otherwise healthy body. As the former editor of the Annals of Internal Medicine, Frank Davidoff, once observed, who has seen a blood sugar? Right? Diabetes is not a bad body inside an otherwise healthy body, but a disturbance in the set of right relationships that constitute the homeostasis of the thing we call a human being. Now, ancient peoples readily understood sickness as a disturbance in relationships. And since these peoples had a keen sense of relationship between human beings and the cosmos, the task of the shaman was to heal by restoring the relationship between the sick person and the cosmos. Thus, healing was primordially a religious act. It constituted the restoration of right relationships between the patient and the gods. Contemporary scientific healing is also about the restoration of right relationship. However, this scientific healing has heretofore understood itself as limited to the restoration of those relationships that constitute merely the homeostasis of the body as an individual organism. From a purely scientific point of view, though, healing means restoring balance in the blood sugar in relationship to insulin and glucagon and the relationship of the pancreas to the muscle cells and the liver. Restoring someone who's got cancer means making sure that those cells which no longer obey the relationship they ought to have to their neighboring cells gets restored again. Healing somebody who has a disturbance in their heart rhythm means that the atrium, the top of the heart, is now in right relationship electrically and temporally again with the ventricle. Restoring blood pressure to the level that allows the heart and lungs to maintain their proper relationship with other vital organs is what we do when we treat someone who's in shock. So healing is, even in the contemporary sense, restoration of right relationship. But illness, as I have suggested, disturbs more than relationships simply inside the body. It disrupts families and workplaces. It shatters pre-existing methods of coping. It raises serious questions for many patients about their relationships with their God. What medicine seems to be missing today, and I think genuine spirituality can help bring back to it, is this broad understanding of healing as the restoration of right relationships. Not only relationships inside the body, but also between the sick people and their families, their communities, and their God. Now, is the task of doing this, of being a healthcare professional, sufficiently special to warrant calling it a spiritual discipline? Is the practice of healthcare in any way comparable to other religious acts, such as the reading of sacred texts, or fasting, or worship, or prayer? It's tempting at this point to begin to talk about the nature of medicine. However, to talk about the nature or essence of medicine, I think, is philosophically problematic. Medicine is a human practice, but it's not an already out there now real. It's not except in the most Baroque forms of scholastic philosophy, and I don't want to go there. The idea, though, that's typically offered as the alternative to an essentialist view of medicine is a social constructivist view. On this view, medicine is construed merely as a socially constructed enterprise with no fixed boundaries or goals other than what a given society decides it is to be. That view also seems to me to be fundamentally naive. And that's easier to convince physicians of than students in a divinity school. But let me suggest to you that a ruptured appendix followed by sepsis and death is not a social construction. Okay? But a series of objective events to which other human beings somehow feel compelled to respond. The same would be true of almost any other form of illness and injury. Medicine as a social institution is not merely a social construction. I mean, it is a social enterprise, but it's one of the primary responses that a society must make to the objective facts of illness, injury, and death. And the task of human medicine has at least this much objectivity to it, that the subject of the task is a human being. And human beings are a natural kind, distinguished from the rest of reality as particular kinds of things. Human beings are governed by law-like principles that collect together the actual extension of the humankind around an arbitrary good specimen of it. Whether that arbitrary good specimen is Socrates or Michael Balboni, most of you have enough similarities to Michael Balboni to say you're human just like him, right? And there are law-like principles that also determine the characteristic development and typical history of members of the extension of all of us who are collectively called human beings. Medical science is the science of these law-like principles and the study of the characteristic development and typical history of human beings, particularly in their biological dimension. Of course, science doesn't fully explain what it is to be human, but science helps us to understand the biological conditions that are conducive to our flourishing as the kinds of things that we are. And so I take the goal of medicine in a fundamental way to be this: to help our fellow human beings to flourish as the kinds of things that they are, in and through a ministry to the biological aspects of the human. The biological may not be sufficient for our flourishing, but I think you would agree that it's at least an instrumental good in terms of our flourishing. If you die of infantile diarrhea, you will never dance with your daughter at her wedding. Right? If you are cognitively impaired, you will not be able to prove mathematical theorems or become the mayor of your village. If you have a stroke, you may never be able to paint that masterpiece. And if your coronary arteries narrow prematurely, you will never be able to open your heart again in love or in worship. So the kinds of things we are, all of us, begins in our status as primate mammals. We are more than that, but we are fundamentally biological beings. And so it is that when I visit the accountant, I can say that my taxes are the issue. When I visit the auto mechanic, I can say that my carburetor is the issue. But in a very real sense, when I visit the doctor, I am the issue.